Please briefly summarize your industry education, professional background, and current role at the Adrianople Group.
So I'm the director of research at the Adrianople Group. We're really the world's only serious data-driven business intelligence firm in the special economic zone industry. And I come from a little bit of an eclectic background. Before this, I started the first think tank in the US that really studied special economic zones in depth.
How does the Adrianople Group fit within the infrastructure industry?
The infrastructure industry is, if you go through Wikipedia on the list of the world's largest ports, airports, railway stations, and you eliminate all of the ones that are in the Western world, you eliminate Europe and America, you'll find that virtually all of the special economic zones, all of these major infrastructure points are special economic zones. And the reasons for this is because businesses need two things in order to operate. They need physical infrastructure. They need utilities, they need water, they need easy access to raw materials and logistics, and ways to move people and get the labor market. But they also need legal stability. They need to know how rules and regulations will look in a few years. So what special economic zones represent is that market need for there to be legal stability. And SEZs will, in countries that have more complicated legal systems, adopt a more Western familiar, a more sort of internationally standard legal system to facilitate doing business in the areas around these key infrastructure hubs.
You kind of described what special economic zones, SEZs, are. Is there anything you left out in your last answer? And also, how do they change infrastructure planning?
Typically, the infrastructure is actually planned around the special economic zone, which is very interesting. And so in terms of the main use cases for SEZs, let's imagine that you have a country that's very corrupt. A study by Transparency International found that the average Kenyan business person had to pay 16 bribes a month to survive. Imagine you're a foreign business person. You have to bribe 9 people. You have to pay a bribe for the building permit. You have to pay a bribe for the employment permit. You have to bribe the tax collector, and you don't really have much of a choice. Well, if you're an American company and you're caught doing this, you will get in trouble in the US by US law. So it's very important that countries fight against corruption. And a major tool to improve ease of doing business, to improve efficiency, are special economic zones. Special economic zones represent the partial privatization of the legal system. Typically, what you'll have is you'll have an agency called a one-stop shop, and they'll consolidate all of these little permits you need into a single agency that is very much monitored for accountability and for responding to the business permits on time, and they'll pick up your call, right? So what you find is that the countries that just do the infrastructure without adopting market reforms, right? What you find is that countries that might build a deep water seaport, well, it will not actually succeed in attracting any businesses because Maersk and, Hamburg Süd and none of the big companies in their right mind want to step into the legal quagmire that could be corruption in emerging markets. So of course, special economic zones don't always work. There have been some spectacular failure stories, but they serve to provide legal stability in these areas where otherwise infrastructure alone would not be sufficient.
So how are these SEZs chosen, and how are they delineated, and who does that?
So it depends on which countries. There's 2 models. There's the Soviet model that I actually called the designation-based model. This is how Deng Xiaoping reformed China, where proverbially, what you'll have is a government official that will take a Sharpie and will draw on the map, maybe off the basis of some planning, and the government will just one day say, this area will be a zone. But other countries have the opposite model. In Colombia, I forget what the exact requirements, so I'm going to make something up, but let's just say that everybody who has 300 employees and 500 square meters of contiguous land and more than 3 companies operating on that land, or some requirements like that, can apply. These are application-based systems. So in some countries, It's like the government that just designates it off the basis of various criteria. In some countries, businesses, private business parks apply for the status. In terms of the designation-based countries, it actually varies quite a bit. Sometimes it's economically distressed areas that are just designated to attempt to revitalize them. Sometimes it's key infrastructure hubs that are designated. Sometimes it's random. Sometimes it's the crony capitalists who want to have their district, designated. So really, there's no rhyme or reason on an international level. So how these things come about, everything under the sun. And then there's kind of a third hidden program, which we kind of call the exotic ones. Like, how in the world do you classify the Serbian zone where you have to know, the government official that's theoretically designation based, but is really application based? How do you classify the Pyongyang special economic zone? So there's sort of this infinite multitude of how these things come about. But a key thing to understand is that they've been around for a very long time, centuries. They're proliferating at an incredible rate. 1/3 of all new zones have been created in the last 5 years. And as the world becomes more global and the need for transparency increases, you're only going to see more and more of them.
So what is the open zone map and how can it help SEZs?
Believe it or not, until October 25th, 2021, nobody had made a comprehensive map of every single special economic zone in the world, asterisk, that met certain inclusion criteria. So we decided to do what any sensible person would do. And we got 40 of our best friends and spent the next 2 years sitting down and made the map ourselves. What's very interesting is that if you look at all of the academic research, really in studying in the early 1990s, the World Bank started trying to sponsor all of this research. Are these zones working? What are the best practices? And they couldn't even have the very basic data, which is just a list of zones to start. So all SCZ studies over the last 30 years, there's only about 150 of them, end with the following sentence: the study could not be completed due to the lack of data, almost word for word. So this is just the very beginning. And another thing is that in the infrastructure FDI world, I think people have a very antiquated mindset. And they really believe in closed source technology. So we really wanted to put the data in the public domain. Anyone can use it for any purpose, commercial, non-commercial, same license as Wikipedia. There's an email address, you just email it, you get all the data automatically. And that's because we really want to help researchers and other people to build their tools. And in terms of who made the map, we're the Adrianople Group. We're a very small operation. It's a husband and wife team. My wife Katerina helped make the map as sort of the architect of it, and it's a few of our friends, Preston. So it's a very small team, and the map has been such a success that we're now working on a whole bunch of other maps of physical infrastructure.
So what should our engineering audience need to know about SEZ so that they can improve their work?
If your engineering audience operates anywhere in Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, or Africa, if they really operate anywhere outside of the US, Europe, and Australia, chances are they're already quite familiar with special economic zones. Chances are that this is just part and parcel of doing business, although it could be that it's hidden, so in that only the accountants and the lawyers know about it. In terms of what you need to know is that doing business in a special economic zone often comes with a wide variety of incentives for the project. The Western companies that are operating in the zones will have tax codes, labor laws, visa policies that are more similar to doing business in the US than doing business in that country, right? So, or more similar to doing business in Germany or whatever. So a key thing to understand is that a lot of the Western businesses operating in these emerging markets tend to cluster in small physical areas that are the special economic zones. There's so much fascinating stuff about special economic zones. There's a revolution that's happening right now with global governance. And more, especially with the pandemic, people are realizing that having not just people talk about sustainable development goals, but really the missing 34th sustainable development goal that needs to be there is efficiency. And inefficient governments literally result in millions of deaths. In fact, if you are to look throughout history at the worst tragedies in human history, right? If you're to look at the great famines in China, if you're to look at the famines of the Middle Ages, right? If you're to look at the Black Death, just going back centuries, right? A lot of these problems fundamentally stem from slow and inefficient bureaucratic bureaucracy. And what's ironic is that we always think about the devastation and the destruction and human suffering in terms of, you know, the exciting events like wars and hurricanes, but it's really the everyday grind of filing the paperwork and it being slow and your family not being able to provide for it that is sort of really killing people. And during the pandemic, what happened is that all of industry shut down. Elon Musk has a great quote, but all economists from Adam Smith till the present have mirrored it. If you don't make stuff, you don't have stuff. So what happened is that many special economic zones became physical quarantine zones because they were already fenced off. So many zones never shut down during the pandemic. 70% of the world's supply of nitrile gloves came from 4 special economic zones, 2 in Thailand and 2 in Malaysia. And the fact that you just had these walled off areas that were legally separate that could just quarantine meant that could continue. If you look at a lot of the famines, for example, the Great Famine in China is a fascinating case study, right? It wasn't that the Chinese government was unable to grow enough crops to feed people. It was that they were unable to process the crops into food fast enough and the crops would waste. It was fundamentally a supply chain problem. So what happened is that when you had many, you know, so this is a case of agro-processing being almost, and the means of distributing the food being almost more important than any other factors, right? So at the end of the day, what I think civil engineers need to remember is that all of human society is just this great chain of people, and everybody is just trading stuff from farmers and engineers at the end of the day. And all of society, you know, is just a few steps removed doing stuff to please farmers and engineers, and I guess manufacturers who actually make the stuff we use every day. And I think that SEZs are part of this great supply chain, and we really need to think about efficient government as a life-saving tool and about how we can make our infrastructure serve human needs much better.